Alright, behind me is the CR500 and we're going to dig this sucker on out. Lauren did her part and has cleaned this room up. So now I can remove the bike from this room and get it back down to the garage. Well, behind me over here is the CR500 Street Racer project. It's the beginning of May. Unfortunately, the two-stroke meetup that was going on up at Deals Gap is this week and not the end of May as I thought. So unfortunately, my deadline got all screwed up on that. Needless to say, life happens. I picked up too many other projects. I've just got way too much going on in my life right now, which includes a Carmen Ghia that I'm trying to restore for Lauren so I can get that sucker back on the road. And this project, unfortunately, had to take the back seat. So today's goal, which is what everybody really wants to see, is to see this thing run. So what I'm going to do is reassemble the top end, torque everything down, get it all sealed up, throw some two-stroke oil in there, throw some two-stroke oil in the gas, get that carb nice and saturated, and let's see if we can light this thing off. Okay, we've got the top end off over here. That consists of, at this point, removing the two front bolts and the swing arm bolt. And I found that the best way to make this happen is just by sticking a hammer underneath the motor, just enough to push it up. And it only needs about 3/4 of an inch or so. At that point, the cylinder can slide off the top. So right now what we've got is we've got our connecting rod right here. We've got our piston, which is nice and set up. I've got the wrist pin on the one side. We've got the needle bearings right here, which are going to go into the rod, which then the wrist pin is going to go right on through. And we finally have the last circlip here that holds in the wrist pin. Now this, you want to be very careful that you don't lose it. These things can have a tendency to spring out and jump and just fly into oblivion and get lost. And you also want to make sure that it doesn't fall down inside the crankcase, because if it does, you got to pull this whole damn thing out and shake it until that thing falls out, because you cannot run that motor with this thing in the bottom of that crankcase. You'll just destroy it. So we're going to put this sucker together right now. It's going to require a lot of lube, and the only oil that I happen to have right now at this moment is some cheap outdoor two-stroke oil. You guys are going to complain, you guys are going to whine, you guys are going to say all kinds of shit, but you know what? This is just fine for assembly. Down the road, when I start pre-mixing it and putting gas in here, we'll mix something much better. But for the time being, that's what we're going to use. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to cover the crankcase area before we put that piston in there, because if we drop that circlip, we do not want it to fall down into that crankcase. Alright, that should get me to where I want to be. Next thing we got to do is we have to oil up the connecting rod. We want to oil up that needle bearing, and we want to oil up the wrist pin before we push this all together. So we're going to handle that next. I'm going to need both hands, so we're not going to pull out the camcorder for just a moment until everything's lubed up. Okay, we've got everything all lubed up. We got the needle bearing into the connecting rod, and now we're going to start dropping the piston. And the first thing we want to observe is that there is a difference in the skirts. You see, one side is scalloped and the other side is squared. And the reason why is because the intake side, which is where the reed valves are at, you want to be open as much as possible. So that's why they scalloped that off. There is a label on the piston that indicates what direction it faces in, and in this case, that's the in. So the intake is on that side. And the exhaust, of course, would be on the other side, which is the square end. So make sure your piston's oriented correctly, and this applies to all engines, whether they be two-stroke or four-stroke. There is a piston orientation most of the time that allows the piston to push to the correct side of the cylinder that it was designed to minimize the wear, as well as other features, such in the case of two-stroke, where the intake and exhaust is actually timed via the piston. Alright, we've got the piston in place. The last thing to go in is the wrist pin circlip. You want to make sure that this sucker doesn't fly anywhere and that you're not going to lose it. Once again, that's why we have this rag packed in the crankcase, so we don't drop it in there. In addition, I've also covered the water pump So that way those things don't fall down inside of that, because that wouldn't be a nice thing either. I mean, it's kind of big to go in there, but who knows? Cover it anyway. Alright, next pop that right on in there, and then the piston is assembled. On the intake side of the piston is where the ring gaps go. There's two little divots that are here, and when you pinch these rings together, the gap in the rings will line up with those, and that's what stops the rings from shifting around, from dragging into a port and getting chewed up. So you make sure that these are oriented correctly. It's kind of difficult, if not almost impossible, to have them misaligned, because if you do, you can't push the ring into its seat. So those little gaps must align. So you get that set up. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to lubricate all this, get oil all over the piston, all over the rings, make sure they're nice and lubed up, and then we're going to slide the cylinder down over this. Now the cylinder is unique in that it's tapered on the bottom. Most two-strokes are this way. So when you push the piston and you squeeze the rings from here, and then you shimmy it gently into place, and then push the cylinder right down on top of that piston, just like that. And at that point, everything should be smooth. You make sure that everything's nice and clean in here. Actually, this is looking pretty good altogether. And it's clean, there's no dirt in it. Also critical, you don't want to have any debris that's going to chew up the cylinder walls or the piston skirts. So, the suckers get installed right now. You also want to lubricate the inside of the cylinder, so put some oil on your finger and just run it around the inside of this sucker. Lube up the piston, run it around there, get it in the rings, and next, you drop this thing down on top. Temporarily, we've left the base gasket out. And we did that on purpose, and that's because I don't have one. So what I use is a little bit of a forma gasket on there just temporarily, because all we're going to do is we're going to get this thing fired up just one time so everybody can see it running. The piston is in place, the rings are seated in their positions, and the cylinder is ready to drop into position. There it is. Now we got to put the nuts back on. There's 4 of them all around the corners. Once those are in place, we'll retorque the head, which actually I left on there on purpose so that way the cylinder wouldn't get distorted when I removed it from the base, because I've heard some stories of that happening. So I've left the head affixed to the cylinder so that way it didn't sit loose for a long period of time. And I've got the 4 bolts torqued back down. The cylinder is now in place, so the engine is now one piece. So now we got to bolt it back into the frame and get a couple of things here buttoned up. Put the carburetor back on, get the ignition system and spark plug reinstalled, put the kicker on, and we should be able to start her up. Alright, the motor is in, the swing arm is bolted back on, everything's good and solid. You can hear the compression and I can feel it, even without spark plug in I can feel it. But everything's turning over smoothly. So nothing's jamming up or acting weird. So I think that's good. So next we gotta install the electrical system, slap the carb on there, and put a little gas in it and see what happens. Cold exhaust. This is the first kick that I'm going to give this bike. I don't know what it's going to do. I don't know how it's going to behave. Cold exhaust. This bike has not been run. I don't know what it's going to do. I don't even know if it's going to start. So we're going to see what's going to happen. There's fuel in the tank. Fuel is switched on. There is no cooling system currently hooked up, so we can only run it for a very, very short period. But let's see what happens. Bump it past the compression. Probably should do this a couple times. Let it pull a little gas into the motor. Here we go. Just past the compression right there. And kick. And kick. That's all we're going to run it without a cooling system. Because that thing's going to start getting hot. And it's starting to get a little warm, so we'll just cut it off. But it runs. It runs good. Well, there's still a few things we need to sort out on here. We need to get the cooling system hooked up, and it would be hooked up now, except I couldn't find one of the hoses to it. So I had to run it without it. But for dramatic effect, we ran it anyway. I started it anyway. I got it going and running in the month of May, just like I said I was going to, so I made my own deadline. I got to get the front brake working. There is no front master cylinder here yet. I had one, as you remember, but I ended up putting it on the SV650 when I put the GSXR front end on there. So we need to find another one for that and get these front brakes hooked up. In addition, we need to get the rear sets set up on this, along with the rear brake that's here, and get it configured. And the rear set on the other side, I need to get the shifter set up. So the shifter has no ability to be connected yet. So once we get that going, this thing will be rideable. And of course, I need, optionally, an exhaust silencer. And I think that would probably be a pretty good idea because this thing is loud as hell. Loud as hell. Anyways, it does run, and it runs good. Anyways, it does run, and it seems to run pretty good. Though I think something is wrong with the carburetor because the choke felt a little funny to me, and it felt like it was coming apart. So I got to look into that and see if something's either wrong with it or if something's just not connected properly. But all in all, CR500 Sportbike Street Racer, it runs. And I need to put the bolt in the kicker. I accidentally forgot. I got ahead of myself, got excited, and it didn't get hooked up.